Welcome to Uncommon Sense, where we do our best to make it common again. I'm your host, Adrian Ahlquist, and today I'm joined by Stuart Kolner, who is again on our board of the Society of Gilbert Keith Chesterton, and a convert whose story is in My Name is Lazarus. So just like Brandon Vogt and Brent Forrest before this, we're continuing our My Name is Lazarus series. How are you, Stuart?
I'm doing great. Pleasure to be with you.
Yeah, thanks so much. Thank you for joining us. I read your story in My Name is Lazarus, and again, I'm very inspired. I was telling you before this, I was very inspired by the story. All the stories in that book are very inspiring to read and entertaining. I suggest that you pick it up at our shop. You can go to chesterton.org/shop to get it. But yeah, let's kind of go through your story, the story of your conversion and kind of your life.
All right. Yes, it's in retrospect, all I can do is shake my head over the arc of my story as a Catholic convert. I was born in the early 50s in a post-World War II America, which was very much a world of science. Science was going to be our salvation. Science is, after all, what ended the war. The development of the atomic bomb nipped the war in a bud, so to speak, and it's became very real to me when my father informed me when I was old enough to understand such things, that at the time the bomb was dropped, he, who had been in the Battle of the Bulge in the 101st Airborne, fighting in World War II in the European theater, was actively training for the invasion of Japan. And
wow.
it was projected to be an invasion with a tremendous number of casualties on both sides. So there's a very real chance that I wouldn't be here talking to you now had it not been for the dropping of the bomb, as horrific as that was. Anyway, it was science in a sense saving the world, so to speak, ending the war in that regard. But not just that. It was a world of space exploration, which I was fascinated with as a little boy. We got out of school so I could walk home and watch John Glenn orbit the Earth, for instance. We lived and died with all news of the space program. It was an age when vaccinations were saving us. Polio was an epidemic during my childhood. In fact, I have a first cousin who had polio and survived it, but it was a killer and terrifying. And when I was in elementary school, the vaccine came out, which saved us from the scourge of polio. So science was providing all of these answers. My father was a chemical engineer and one of the co-inventors of Marlex, or polypropylene, which is in wide use now. He was involved in the early days of polymer chemistry, the development of high-density polyethylene and things like that. So at home, I was steeped in the practicability of science. And as a result of all of these forces, I came to believe that the world was knowable through science. And it's sort of a scientism approach, that the only knowledge of any significance was obtainable through the scientific method, the scientific progress. So empiricism, in a sense, was what it was all about.
I wanted to eventually get into that, your complicated relationship with science, because you mentioned how you thought everything was answerable through science, but then not only did you discover that there were certain things unanswered, but also just unanswerable. We kind of have proves or evidence that there are things that are unanswerable in science. I remember you didn't go into a lot of detail in the book about that, which gives us an opportunity to talk about it here.
Sure.
Yeah, but sure. Actually, first, let's actually go to the beginning of your story, because I remember you said that one of the miracles that Chesterton should be given credit for is your conversion.
right,
for a number of reasons, right?
right.
And the first reason is that it's unexplainable by any other means, which is funny to hear. But do you want to go into that?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I was leading up to by being a product of this environment. Also, the environment I was raised in was strangely devoid of Catholicism. I mean, I did not know a single Catholic until I moved overseas. I heard very little about it. My father was Lutheran. My mother was Southern Methodist, and if anything, anti-Catholic. So anything I might have heard about the faith was a prejudice against it, really. Um, so the likelihood that I would come face to face with the question of conversion to the Catholic faith was, you know, immeasurably small. I would say zero. In fact, in my story, 0% mathematical probability, based on my experience, my exposure, my lack of exposure to Catholicism. But one of the things I soon encountered, deciding I would also embark on a career in science, I soon encountered was the discomfort science has with paradox. Paradoxes are inescapable, and science hastens when it encounters a paradox to explain it away. It does not, by its very nature, it does not tolerate paradox. And I've come to realize that it's always significant. Paradox is always significant. One of the first examples I encountered of this was in physics when I was learning about relativity and the experimentation that led up to Einstein's great insight. Um, Most of the inconsistencies of measurement that led Einstein to the theory of relativity were dealt with by science, by the consensus, as noise in the system or limits of the tools they were using to measure accurately. Whereas Einstein looked at these inconsistencies and thought, maybe the message is in the paradox. Maybe these aren't something we need to explain away, but maybe we need to focus on those.
Hmm.
And in doing so, he discovered a world that defies imagination. I mean, the world of
Right.
relativity is so counterintuitive that it has taken decades for the best minds in physics to even begin to think in relativistic terms. It,
I know, and then you get into the world of quantum physics,
right,
and right, and there's this phenomenon called quantum superposition, where
yeah,
it seems like the particles acting in two contrary ways. We don't say it is these two different ways because it seems to be contradicting to say that, but we say it's acting in these two different ways at the same time, and that's a perfect example of a paradox. They just call it superposition, which I've heard quantum physicists say that's just our name for saying we don't know what's going on.
exactly.
Right.
Yes, yes. Early on, I came upon this scientific principle called the black box,
Right.
which means we know what goes into it, we know what comes out, and we have no idea what goes in between those two.
Yeah.
And yeah, so science does not tolerate a paradox. It has to explain it away somehow.
Hmm.
And yet, the more the wheels of physics turn, the more it becomes clear that paradoxes exist, particularly on the scale of the very, very small and the very, very large. You know, the cosmic scale, as well as the world of quarks
Hmm.
and neutrinos and so forth.
Right. It still confounds me though that scientism is prevalent even in the world of science, because you have principles in science like the Heisenberg uncertainty principle, which basically tells us that you cannot know all that there is to know. You cannot
Right,
know a particle's location and position and velocity at the same time,
and
right? Is that right?
velocity, right,
Yeah.
right, right.
Yeah.
And so there are, and those are always uncomfortable for physicists to deal with and to talk about. And I know this because I have a son-in-law who is a physicist,
Oh, really?
and incidentally, just a few months ago, a Catholic convert.
Oh, wow. Wow.
Yeah, he married my daughter, so he didn't have a
Oh,
chance
yeah. Okay.
of
There you
not
go.
being that. But yes, and it's so interesting to me to watch a man of science writhe on the point of this on this paradox and try to use tools that are impotent to explain it away and yet somehow come to an explanation. And
Mm,
so many physicists who became cosmologists have come all the way to the faith because they encountered the infinite. And that's kind of the way I look at a paradox in science, is that wherever the finite world meets the infinite, there has to be a paradox because our
mm.
finite minds cannot possibly penetrate that veil. And so to us, it becomes something mythic, something fabulous
Right.
because
That's exactly actually what I've been saying is since we cannot grasp the concept of infinity, that's where we run into these problems slash paradoxes, these estimations. That's exactly what I've been saying. That's very consoling to hear you you agree with me on that. Yeah,
absolutely,
that's
absolutely.
great.
And science by its nature won't dwell on that paradox and look
Mm.
for meaning within it. Instead, it tries to shove it under the carpet and move on to things that it knows it can measure.
Right. Right.
So anyway, as I encountered this and began to study science, in this case biology and pre-medicine, these things began to look to me like uh, an inauthentic claim to knowledge.
Mm.
That science would fill this vacuum with fables. An example would be the Big Bang. Okay, well, we know at some point there was a cataclysm, but we really don't know anything about it. We know a lot of things don't make sense about it. Some do, some don't. For instance, the Big Bang, as we understand it, should have created the same amount of matter and antimatter, but it didn't. There's way more matter than there is antimatter.
Mm.
Well, what happened to the antimatter? Well, hence the term dark matter, which
Mm.
is to balance that equation with something that we don't know. So it's a question mark, but we've got a name for it. Or and that halfway through our known duration of the universe, it began expanding at an increasing rate. In other words, the expansion of the universe accelerated. Why is that? How could that possibly be unless there were some force out there pulling it? So hence dark energy. So these are things that are proper for science to wonder about, but science has no tool that can measure them, assess them, test them. And yet, instead of passing these on to the next generation as speculations, theories, and so forth, they're passed on as dogmas. Uh, this was never more true, made truer to me than as a student of biology, the dogma of the Darwinian idea of speciation. In other words,
Right.
Darwin's explanation for where all the variety of life came from. And uh, this is taught as absolute inviolable doctrine in biology classes, even though it is a theory that Darwin himself doubted
Yeah. Yeah.
and saw lists of objections to, but it's taught as inviolable dogma. So um, it's a failing of science, not so much the activity of science, but the fact that it passes it along as if it were proven.
Yeah, yeah. Another instance where I have encountered this, and I think it was my older brother Julian who got this on my radar, was how scientists and science deals with the concept of randomness.
Right,
When something is random, whether they say truly random or pseudo random. I mean, let's say you're rolling a die. You know, you're trying
right.
to you have this random quote unquote effect, but we say what? Well, if you knew all of the different variables that went into rolling a die, it wouldn't be random, right? So yes, okay, great. So but then there are things that are apparently truly random, where if you knew the causes, I mean, they suppose that if they knew the causes, it would still be random. And that's where we run into a problem with how we're defining random. It seems
Right.
like the definition should be that we don't know the cause of it, because if we knew the cause of something, it's predictable, right? But
Sure.
that's why something is unpredictable, is because we don't know something about it. We don't know the
Right.
cause of it, or something along those lines. So
Yeah.
it's a problem where, they say, instead of "we don't know this thing," they just put in the word random. No, it's just random,
Hence,
right?
hence chaos theory,
Yeah, it's chaos theory.
which
Yeah,
is
yeah,
like a name for, well, we have no idea, but we figure there must be an explanation for it.
yeah,
So
yeah.
yeah.
Anyway, well, sorry for people who are not following the science conversation. We can get to some more grounded stories now.
Yeah. But well, anyway, back to my story. Yeah,
Yeah.
I was my conversion was it's so hard for me to explain and to understand, even at this point, by anything I did or merited, that it dawned on me that or it looks to me through that lens like it was miraculous. And in one sense, all the actions of grace are miraculous in that they're a gift. They come from we know not where.
Right.
We know we don't merit them, and yet there they are. They're unmistakable. So it's a bit with tongue in cheek that I propose my conversion of such a grandiose scale that it would justify a canonization. But nonetheless, to me, it was a miraculous undertaking. And although there were other factors, Chesterton was certainly one of them. So I break down a miracle that you need for canonization into four characteristics. One is it has to be unexplainable by other means.
Hmm.
It's instantaneous, and mine was at certain instance. It's comprehensive and it's permanent. So that's kind of the way I based my story, and my name is Lazarus. I sort of use that as a rough outline, but I
Right.
did I did have some instantaneous tectonic shifts in my relationship to my faith.
Right. I was going to ask about them. What were these instantaneous moments?
I think the first one was really when I was courting my wife, who was the first Catholic I ever really knew well. Um, and I describe in my chapter the frustrations I had as someone who thought of himself as scientific and coldly rational, and yet every objection, every idea that I had against the faith, she simply swatted away with great ease, and it drove me crazy. Um, but but it also fascinated me. Here was one of the first things I couldn't argue away,
Hmm.
and another paradox in my life. Um, but I also was drawn to her, and I couldn't argue away my attraction for her. And she made it clear that if we were going to have a life together, she intended to live as a Catholic with all that meant. And so the instantaneous moment of grace on my part was to accept that and to say, okay, I will always, and this is a requirement she had of me. Was that I always be open to the faith,
Hmm.
and not cross my arms and say, all right, you be Catholic and I'll be what I am, but rather I'll always be open.
Yeah.
And I have no idea why I made that promise, but in my own mind, I knew that would never happen, that I would never convert. But I also was the kind of person who, having made that promise, would stick with it. And I mean, to my ultimate undoing, I remained open to
I
it.
know. It's funny how our kind of our modern society values open-mindedness a lot, because if you are truly open-minded, the Catholic Church starts to become very attractive looking. Right.
Right,
Yeah.
right. That's right. As
Yeah.
Chesterton said, as soon as you stop pulling from it, you feel a tug toward it.
Right.
Uh, so anyway, unaccountably, I abandoned all my cool scientific rationalism and stepped into this world of acceptance, at least openness to the idea of the Catholic faith. And um, so that was one instantaneous kind of, I still remember the afternoon where it happened, where I had absolutely no idea, but I was sort of watching myself, and with disbelief, I thought, all right, I'm doing this.
Yeah.
I'm jumping in with both feet. I have no idea what this means, but here we go. Another was, I call it an epiphany, but when we were first married, we lived in Evanston, Illinois, and I would ride the elevated train to work down at the medical center in Chicago at the University of Illinois. And it was like an hour-long commute each way, and I'd read if I could find a seat. And I was reading Everlasting Man through the influence of my wife's father, who's the one who really introduced me to Chesterton.
Mm.
And I still remember the day. It was in the morning. No, it was in the afternoon. I was on my way back. I was reading this thing, and for some reason I looked up and I looked around the car I was riding in, and I looked at the faces of the people in that car, and I knew in an instant that the gospel story, just as the church passed it along to us, was absolutely true. It wasn't a pretty story. It wasn't an interesting fable. It wasn't a historical treatise. It was true, exactly as it was intended to be communicated.
Right. That was a very, very awesome point in your story. It was kind of the climax of your story. I remember that when you were reading Everlasting Man. It's funny because that was the first book that my dad read by Chesterton, and it
Is
was
that
on his
right?
honeymoon. It was on his honeymoon in Rome when he was
That's
reading
right.
it. That's funny.
Yeah.
Yeah.
How many people take Chesterton on their honeymoon?
Yeah, I don't know how. Maybe some of our loyal fans do.
Right.
My mom was reading Les Mis,
Oh,
incidentally.
sorry.
Yeah,
Oh, yeah.
they
Well,
they
anyway,
like the stuff. Mm.
I mean, I can't really, even to this day, say that I totally understand or comprehend Everlasting Man, but I knew in that instant that everything he was talking about, the beautiful descriptions he has of the gospel story and its place in history, and the uniqueness of Christ as described in the gospel, that it all just sort of went click and everything fell into place right
Right.
then. And all I can describe it as the moment of grace, that
Mhm.
somehow that happened. But since then, that's happened to me with Chesterton many, many times.
Mhm. Yeah,
I've
we
never had that happen to me in a book of science or
yeah,
Shakespeare or almost anything else. But
which is not to knock those things because
right,
science is very entertaining, and it's great because it has to do with observing our world.
oh yeah,
And Shakespeare is great, obviously. But
yeah,
yeah, I agree. At Chesterton, we start with orthodoxy freshman year, and then we move to Everlasting Man. That's the last book they read, which
yeah.
I think we were going for that effect, that tying everything together and having that revelation.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, as Lewis said about Everlasting Man, which he attributed to his own conversion to Christianity, he said an atheist had better be careful about what he reads.
Mhm. Right. Yeah. Well, that's great. So how the third step to the miracle is it has to be comprehensive, right?
Comprehensive,
Yeah.
yes. And in my own story, I interpret that to mean that pretty much everything about me changed. All of the presuppositions I had about Catholicism and about human being as a biological entity, um, our place in the history of the world, evolution, all these things have changed. I Before I was a convert myself, but after I was married, when we were preparing for our marriage through these pre-Cana classes we would take, I would learn about natural family planning and the church's opposition to contraception, and I thought, oh man, this doesn't make sense biologically. Why would we not take advantage of our abilities to manipulate hormones and
Right.
prevent this, and be scientific about our family planning? And um, but I came to understand through that study the beauty of it, the natural, uh, the beauty and the health of the natural approach, and using our understanding of the hormone circadian rhythms of life, um, to plan our families instead of using something that carries with it unknown risks, possibly uterine cancer, breast cancer, so
Hmm.
on and so forth. Why would you do otherwise?
Right, right.
And then on the other side of that coin, if you're struggling with infertility, understanding these rhythms and taking advantage of them leads more times than not to an improved chance of fertility and childbearing and so forth. So I remember agreeing to, at the time, the Catholic norms on fasting on Fridays, avoiding or abstinence on Fridays, avoiding meat, even though much of the world had discarded that
Mhm.
because the church had officially opened the door to alternative means of penance on Friday. It never really ruled out
Yeah.
avoiding meat. And my wife, being the daughter of a traditional Catholic, Tridentine Mass Catholic, um, we have always avoided meat on Friday. And I became, it became clear to me that this teaches one about the importance of abstaining periodically from pleasures of the world and so forth, and the grace and health that flows from that kind of understanding. And I agreed to raise my children Catholic, even though I was sure I would never be a Catholic. But again, I can't account for why I would make that agreement when I was, a sort
Sure.
of Protestant agnostic.
May I ask, how did you have kids when you converted, or was it before you had any
Yes,
kids?
I had one. My oldest son was 2 years old at the time I converted, so I should attribute some of my conversion to
Mhm. Okay.
him.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
But yeah, I mean the whole the effort of learning enough faith to begin to transmit it to my children turned out to be salutary for my own faith. I mean, there's nothing that increases your knowledge better than the challenge of teaching it to someone else. You become much more intimately acquainted with it. So that served my own faith in that regard as well. So almost every aspect of my life changed. My career, I was a medical librarian, and like a couple of years after I converted, suddenly I decided that I would go full circle back to pre-med and apply to medical school,
Mm.
which I did. And no one at the time went to medical school when they were 33 years old, but that's what I was proposing to do. No one applied to only one medical school. The dogma was you needed at least five because you weren't going to get in to your first choice. I applied to one and got in, and somehow did well at it. And these were not my own doing. These were doors that were flung open somehow by my acquiescing to all of these things, that all these grace opportunities that came my way. I can't take credit for any of it, but for some reason, being able to just say, okay, I assent to this, suddenly life became clear,
Wow.
comprehensive in that
Comprehensive.
regard.
Yeah, there, there it is. Okay, wow. That's great. Well, the last one obviously the miracle has to be permanent, and it seems pretty permanent, doesn't
So
it?
far, yes, 43 years of marriage, a big family, all of them in Catholic families, raising all my grandchildren Catholic, and now my son-in-law, the physicist, a convert, a recent convert. God is good. What can I say? I'd like
Yeah,
to take credit for these things, but I'm riding the wave of grace. That's all I could say. It's a surfing act on my part. So
yeah. That's great. I have another question. How actually? I mean, I should know this, but how long have you been a part of the society on the board here for the Society of GKC?
let's say I've been on the board about 4 years. Um, And it's interesting, when I first got on the board. Well, let me go back to when I first met your father,
Okay.
Dale
Yeah.
Alquist. You cannot be an aficionado of Chesterton without knowing the name Dale Alquist. I mean, it's
Well, thank
synonymous.
you. Yeah.
And uh, I got wind of, through Catholic connections, that in Carroll, Iowa, which is about 45 miles to our west, I live in Ames, Iowa, uh, Dale Alquist was going to give a talk at a vineyard of all things.
Mm. I think I
So
remember this. Yeah.
yeah, we went to the vineyard and heard the talk, and I'd had a couple of glasses of wine. So afterwards, your father knows how to work a room. He's very gregarious, very congenial, very open. And so after a couple of glasses of wine, I got the nerve to go up to him and say, and introduce myself and say, I'm a convert largely due to G.K. Chesterton. And out of his pocket came a notebook, and he wrote down
Yep. Yep.
name and number. And I came to find out that he was compiling a database of people who owe their conversion, at least in part, to Chesterton.
Yeah. Yeah. And I know it's growing. It's a pretty impressive database so far.
It's amazing. It really is. Well, anyway, then I finally, as my career was beginning to wind down in medicine, I decided I'd go to the conference itself. We have some good friends who'd been and talked it up and loved it. And my first one was at Mundelein. And I again saw your father and talked to him. And we are so alike in so many ways. I've often thought we're brothers of different mothers, that kind of thing.
Yeah. Yeah.
But so many similar experiences, an interest in music and uh, um, uh, Nordic ancestry. I'm Norwegian.
Oh,
Partly.
yeah.
Well, anyway, um, the more we talked, the more I enjoyed him, and the more I thought, well, what a great opportunity it is to have some kind of role in this organization. As I said in my story, it's a chance to make installment payments on a debt I can never satisfy to Chesterton. I mean, how do you thank someone for your conversion to the faith? But anyway, this was an opportunity, and so little by little, um, I've gotten more and more involved. And then your father asked me to serve on the board at one point, and I'd been on the board of directors of other organizations, including my clinic. And my first meeting of the board of Chesterton was at your father's house, at your house in Minneapolis, and it became clear to me this was like no board of anything I'd ever been on before. It was loose. There was no agenda. There were no minutes. It was. I just didn't know what to make of it, and I kind of felt like I'm a square peg in a round hole here. This is not like the board of directors I thought I would be on, and I actually offered my resignation at one point because I thought I'm totally inadequate to this, and
I assume my dad didn't accept it.
he accepted it, but he asked me to serve till the end of the year. Meanwhile, Emily had been appointed.
Right.
Emily took charge, and suddenly there was an agenda. There were minutes. There were financials.
Yes, knowing Emily,
all
that's
the things
probably right.
that I was suddenly familiar with as a former board member of other organizations. I felt totally at home in Emily's organization. So I thought, hey, I can do this. So I actually rescinded my resignation, which your father was gracious enough to accept, and the rest is history.
That's great. Yeah. Yeah. Emily is my boss right now, and we have some big plans for the society.
Absolutely.
Achieve
I'll
them.
tell you, she's a breath of fresh air. I mean, she's just what we needed when we needed it. And suddenly it became an organization that I could understand on the board level. And I have been nothing but excited about it, especially the emphasis on the schools. The Chesterton School Network is one of the most exciting things that I've ever heard of. I mean,
I know. Yeah, I know. It's definitely a huge draw to us. I mean, basically the schools network has taken over because it's education is so important and attractive to people right now.
oh yeah.
Yeah.
We're all wringing our hands and wondering, we're seeing society crumble, and we're wondering, what can we do? What can we do? Throw money at a political campaign? No, that isn't going to do it. And education is the answer. It really is.
Right. It's the best investment.
Yes, it is.
Yeah. Well, I think that brings us to the end, Stuart. Thank you so much for telling your story.
It's my pleasure.
Yeah, and everyone, I encourage you to buy My Name is Lazarus at our site, chesterton.org/shop. It should be one of the first options because it's an amazing compilation of conversion stories. And make sure to follow us on all the social medias, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and yes, those are the important ones. But yes, thank you so much for being with us, Stuart. And
glad to be here.
Yeah, thank you. And thanks everyone for tuning in. And until next time, help us to make uncommon sense more common.